Hello and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to go over the layout and cutting of the tenons on the aprons for the occasional table that we're building. I've got some of the tools laid out that we'll be using, including layout tools and some of the different saws and chisels. There's different methods that we're going to go over in this video on cutting out the tenons, but first let's start with the layout. I've got the 4 aprons, which are all the exact same size. This is going to be a square table. Again, all of the dimensions are listed below in the Resources tab. I'm going to start by laying out the grain orientation. Sometimes I can find a piece of wood long enough where all of the pieces come out of the same piece of wood. These 2 pieces are a good example here. You can see how the grain follows through. That's nice because you can actually configure that in your table where the grain actually runs around. That's a nice feature. Let's see, this one actually even looks like it came out of the same piece as well. Sometimes when I'm milling up my wood, if I have a piece that's long enough to get all 4 aprons out of, I'll actually mark on the piece after I cross-cut it to ensure that the grain lines do run all the way through. Another thing that I want to consider here is that each one of these aprons is going to have an arch cut into it. And if you've watched the video that we did on making the shelf, we talk about the grain configuration following the arch. So if you do have a curve to the grain, go ahead and configure that down so that that curve follows, the curve of the grain will follow the actual curvature of the arch that we're going to put into the table. Another thing that you might consider too is the fact that there is going to be some overhang to the tabletop. So if you've got a little knot or something like this, you can hide that underneath the overhang. Or we can simply just turn the apron around. I'm going to do that. I'm going to pick the best face and position that out. Let's do that first. Let's just look at this. As I mentioned, I've got a little knot right there. I turn this one around and I see that there's some cracking or something going on there. A little defect right there. That may be cut off in the tenon. I know that my tenons are going to be 1 inch long, so let's just check that. Let's see if that defect will come off. I think that defect will come off just fine in the tenon. So I can actually turn this around and position it like this. Let's look at this one. There's a knot right there, so I definitely want to put that to the inside. This one here. I think this one is the best grain configuration out. There's a knot right there. Another thing to consider is I don't really want to be cutting an arch inside of that knot because it would be difficult to spoke shave and chisel out. So I might want to put that knot towards the top. I like the grain orientation here. It's running fairly straight. Let's turn this around. That follows through somewhat. Even put it like this. I tend to be a little picky about my grain configuration and picking out the grain, so oftentimes I'll shuffle the boards back and forth and try to determine what I think will look the best. I'm happy with this layout here, so I'll begin by just giving a rough overview. I'm going to start with number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this will be 1, then 2, then 3, and then 4. I'm going to mark it on the outside, just the number 1, 2, 3, and 4. I have the top facing up here at the top, and I'm going to use the top as a reference point. So if you remember from the previous video, that first video that we did on cutting a dado, we talk about a reference face and an edge. So that's very, very important here when we're cutting these tenons. Very important that we work off of a reference face and an edge. So let's put a mark here. I'm going to put an arrow pointing up to this face, this outside face. Of course, this is assuming that this edge is square to the face. Being that we milled this material, it should be square, but you can always verify it. We know that this is a flat face. We can check it to make sure that the edge is square to the face. Now that I've got all of this laid out, I'm going to stack these up just like this. Put them in. I've got the top facing up, and I'm going to put them in the vise just like this. We're going to mark all 4 of these simultaneously. I don't really care if the ends are perfectly flat, although it's nice to get them close. Again, if they're a little bit off, it's not a big problem, and you'll see why here in a second. It's not the ends that I'm worried about, it's the shoulders that I'm worried about. That's why we put all of these together in the vise, just like this. I'm going to measure over 1 inch. That's the length of the tenon. I'm going to start by measuring over 1 inch from the edge and putting a little knife mark here. Then I'm going to come over here and measure 1 inch from the edge and put a little knife mark. When I mark this shoulder, I want to make sure that I work off of a reference face. That is the front face. I've got the arrow pointing to the front face. So just make sure the edge of the square is against that face, and we'll mark this just like that. Again, I've taken the square, it's off of this front face, and we're marking this second shoulder here. And as you can see, what we have here is these shoulders are exactly the same distance, regardless of some minor variation on the end of the tenon. Again, that doesn't matter. But what matters here is the shoulder-to-shoulder distance is exactly the same on all 4 boards. Now what we can do is we can take these lines and carry them around, all the way around, and join them up, defining the shoulders of the tenons. Again, what's extremely important here is that we work off of this top edge and this face as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on this top edge and carry that line down. Then we're going to come here and carry the line like this. Then we're going to come here and carry the line straight down like this. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to go like this, where I go like this, 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 and this. If I do that, there's a chance that the line would not line up when we got to the end. It's very important that that shoulder line lines up perfectly. I'm going to line this up, taking my knife point right there, sliding the square up to it, mark it lightly. Again, mark it very lightly. Work off of this face edge here, bring that line across the edge. Now I'm going to work off of this top edge and connect the two. I've got to do this same layout on all 4 of these aprons on both ends. So I'll carry on by doing that, making very certain that that knife point is right at the edge. And you see how I did that? I'm working off of this top edge here. And I take the knife point, bring it up there, and then slide the square to it. Now I could carry this on, but for me it's more comfortable to just simply hold the square there, turn the knife around, and come back this way. Now we'll work off of this face right here. What's important here is when I position the knife right inside that cut, I position it right at the tip. as opposed to out there. If I put it out there, you see it may not line up perfectly. So position it right at the tip, slide it up. You'll also notice that the knife is angled over so that the very tip of it lines up, and then lightly drag it across, all the way across, multiple times. We'll do the exact same thing over here. I can position the knife right there, position it, then bring this back. And then working off of this front face. See, if I position the knife down here and the knife is angled like that, you can see I'm just a mile away from that line and the lines will not match up. So again, I've got to make sure that the very tip of it is lined up, the knife is up against there, and I bring it across. That way the lines match up perfectly on the other side. I'm finishing up by marking the last of the tenon shoulder, taking care that I match all those lines up perfectly, working off of the same reference face. Now that all the shoulders are marked, it's now time to mark the width of the tenon. We'll do that using the same gauge that we used earlier. We do, however, have to move this fence over because these tenons and aprons here are not going to be flush. They're actually going to be set back from the edge about 1/8 of an inch or so. So they're not going to be flush. If they were going to be flush, we would not move this. We would just set this right against the outside face and scribe it, which would work. But we do want to have a little bit of a reveal there, a little bit of an offset. So I'm going to move this. By moving this, I basically want to make this tenon centered, right in the center of this board here. Again, because we're hand cutting them, it really doesn't matter that it's perfectly centered, but as long as I work off of the same face, that's what matters. Even if I don't get it perfectly centered, what I do want is I want these tenons to be in line. So suppose it was offset just slightly, at least if I work off of the same face with my gauge, then these tenons will be aligned. Let's set the gauge. What we're going to do is we're going to just set it. Should be 3/8 of an inch between the points or whatever width we made our mortise. That will be the distance between the points because remember here we're trying to create a tenon that's going to fit inside of that mortise. The next measurement will be 1/4 of an inch, which should center the tenon on this stock. So I'm going to set my 1/4 inch chisel right to the very point. I like to test it again on a piece of pine just to make sure that we have the measurement right. So now we have it. It's 1/4 of an inch there and 3/8 of an inch there. Now let's suppose that you maybe accidentally made one of these mortises a little wider. I want to talk about some of the problems that you can encounter if you don't mortise perfectly straight. As I've mentioned, you've got to keep that mortise straight. Let's do a little drawing here on the board to just kind of help illustrate what I'm talking about. If I've got my leg here that I'm mortising, we'll just do a cross section through. Here's the mortise coming in like this. Of course, there's going to be another mortise there. But if I angle this, suppose that my chisel is coming at an angle like this, what does that happen? We end up with an angled mortise. And that's exaggerated, but help illustrate the point. Now, if I have an angled mortise like that, when I try to fit my apron in, what's going to happen is that apron's going to go off at an angle and we're going to end up with a parallelogram shaped table instead of a square table. So how do we fix that? Well, we could come in with a chisel straight like this and straighten up that side. The problem here is that this is narrower and this is wider. So then when you stick your tenon in like this, it's going to flop back and forth. So really, the only solution here is to actually widen the entire mortise. So you'd actually have to come in, widen it down at the bottom, and then widen the top. And then you'd have to adjust your tenon to fit accordingly. So you see, then now we have parallel walls. And you can do that by taking your chisel, 1-inch chisel, and sticking it in here and cutting down like this, down at the bottom, making sure that it's straight. You can even take your square on this side and make sure that it's nice and straight like this. You can even come in like this. If I had to widen it, you'd come in like this. I'm not going to do it on this one because it's straight, but you can see you just come in and you'd widen it and make that nice and straight and parallel. So hopefully you won't have to do that, but I thought I would at least offer that as a word of caution there and as a way to fix a mistake if you accidentally angle the mortise. What's important here is that that tenon is going to fit inside of that mortise. Now, if you accidentally made the mortise too wide, or maybe you needed to make the mortise wider because it was angled, I would still stick with this same setting. Okay, you just want to stick with the same setting because this setting gives you a guideline. Even though you might not cut all the way to the line, you're just going to have to make a mental note that maybe one of the tenons is going to be a little bit thicker, and leave that one thicker. Don't cut all the way to the line. I just want to make sure that the distance between those points is right at 3/8. You don't want it narrower than 3/8. You don't want it much bigger than 3/8. You want it right at 3/8. And again, if your mortise is a little bit wider, then you're going to shave it and leave it a little bit wider, but you'll still have those lines marked on here as a reference point to keep your tenons straight. Let's go ahead and mark the tenons. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to mark off of the same face. That way, if our tenon is a little bit off, at least they're in line. I like to put it in the vise when I'm marking it, just to hold the piece. It's really important here that the marks are perfectly straight, that they're not wobbly or wiggling along the edge here. They've got to be nice and straight. So here's the reference face, there's the fence, and we're going to scribe this across. Another key here is lightly. So you see how I'm dragging the gauge? We talked about this in the woodworking joints videos. Very lightly dragging that gauge along and then make it heavier. Dragging it along. Now I'm going to come down the side like this. We can put 2 points there as a point to stop. And there it is, stops right there. Same way here. We'll put 2 points right in there and then slide the gauge down, stopping it in there like this. You could even take this out of the vise and work it like this, pushing it away from you just like that. Again, we're going to work off of that same face. You don't have to put it in the vise. You could even hold it like this. I think that putting it in the vise is beneficial though, because again, you've got to make sure those lines are perfectly straight. You may even like to put it in the vise like this at an angle so you can really let those pins trail. So put it like that, and you're going to loosen it up and mark it just like this. You want to mark all 8 of these tenons in the exact same fashion, taking care that you work off of the exact same face so that it's consistent on every single one. I'm finishing up just the last tenon here, marking the last tenon, defining the width of the tenon with my mortise gauge. Now that I've finished marking all of these tenons, it's time to begin cutting them. The first step to cutting the tenon is to cut the shoulder. I like to cut the shoulders, and there's different ways to cut the cheeks. So we've got the shoulders, which I'm going to cross cut, and then we have the cheeks. Some people like to saw the cheeks, some people like to chisel the cheeks. It's up to you. You can saw the cheeks and then saw the shoulders, but you can't chisel the cheeks first and then saw the shoulders. You have to saw the shoulders if you're going to chisel the cheeks. So hopefully that's not confusing. But for now, we're going to start by sawing the shoulders. Again, because this is a knife cut that goes across the grain, I'm going to start by making a knife wall. You can do that by coming in like this, just like so. Now there's a couple different saws that we can use for cutting across the grain here. You can use a dovetail saw like this. The teeth are fine enough, and we're not making a very deep cut. We're only cutting down 1/4 of an inch. So the dovetail saw works just fine. You'll notice what I did here is I started at this corner. I made a little mark right there. Then I come back here and I lower the saw into it. That just helps me be able to line this up across the entire width of the shoulder. It's important that you watch the video in our Woodworking Joints series on cutting a tenon, because there's a lot of different things that I talk about in that video in regards to overcutting and other techniques. I am going to introduce a couple new techniques here, but it's really important that we don't go beyond the line here. If we go beyond the line, we'll weaken the tenon. Sometimes it's difficult to even see the line, so what you can do is you can darken the line by putting a little black mark there to know where to stop. So I could hardly see the line, so now I've got a little stop sign there, and we'll continue cutting until we get right to that mark. Again, here you notice I'm using the entire length of the saw. That's important. Let's turn it over and we'll cut the other shoulder. I prefer to use this method where I take the chisel and slice it along. It's fast, it's effective. It also is a fast way to mess up your work, so practice it. I want to introduce another saw for cutting this, and that is a cross-cut saw. And if you refer back to our sharpening video series, I explain the difference between a cross-cut and a rip saw. A cross-cut saw, as the name implies, is used for cutting across the grain. So the cross-cut saw is nice. This is a little 12-inch cross-cut saw. I recommend Lee Nielsen actually sells a nice cross-cut saw that is patterned after the Diston cross-cut saw. They sell a couple of them. One is a tenon cross-cut saw, and then one is a carcass cross-cut saw, which I actually like the carcass saw. It's a little bit lighter, a little smaller, but it works very effectively. Either saw will work. If you don't have a cross-cut saw, you can use the dovetail saw. But I think you'll find that the cross-cut saw makes a nice clean cut and it works well. Now that I've cut the shoulders, I can either go on to cutting the cheeks, or I can go through and cut all of the shoulders prior to cutting the cheeks. It's really up to you, whatever you're comfortable with. Being that I have this on the bench and I've got the saws out, let me just go ahead and cut the shoulder on the other end of the board here. Now you see I'm getting a little bit hard material here. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take the chisel and come in this way. And the reason for that is there's a knot there. And that's one thing that I want to show you how to deal with. I'm going to go back and deepen that cut with the knife, and then come in like this with the chisel. And that, right around that knot, the wood is pretty stubborn. It wants to stay on there, so I'm going to have to make multiple cuts over the top of it. There we go. Even come across. That's it. One thing that's very important when you're cutting the shoulders is to make sure that you cut very straight here. Sometimes I'll even undercut it a little bit back like this. What you don't want to do is you don't want to overcut it, because then the shoulder won't pull up tight. Now let's go on to cutting the cheeks. There's different methods for cutting the cheeks, and again, you can saw them, you can chisel them. I'm going to show you first the method for chiseling the cheeks. I've chosen this end of the board because the grain is running perfectly straight. You can look at both ends and you can see how the grain lines are running pretty straight. This end is going to be a little tricky because of that knot. The grain is going to be a little wiry, and you can kind of see that the grain is actually curving a little bit. So we may saw this end right here. This end we're going to chisel. Now you've got to be very careful using this technique because you can ruin your tenon fast. But pay attention to what I'm doing here, and you'll see I'm going to start by cutting above the line. So we're going to cut above the line. We're watching the grain direction. We're making sure that the grain is going straight. If I start too low, too close to the line, then if the grain decided to dive down, it would be too late and I'd end up ruining the tenon. So I'm starting above the cut, taking a little bit off. You'll also notice that I'll position even my finger right here on the bench to hold the chisel in place, and then pop the pieces right off like this. Now I'm not going all the way down to the line. We're just working down close to the line. Okay, close to the line. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to work across the grain. By working across the grain, it really doesn't matter what's going on with the grain going this way. The grain even really could be diving down. But by working across the grain, you're able to smooth it and get a nice flat cut all the way across. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by positioning my finger right up here against the edge, pinching the chisel. We'll work up like this, making a slight cut. Take a little bit more, take a little bit more, and now we'll just work the chisel right across the grain. Now you'll notice what I'm doing is I'm putting two fingers right here on the chisel and making a nice little paring cut right across. We'll gradually make that a little deeper. You'll notice I'm going to stick the chisel right there in my cut line, right there, and work it up. Every cut is working up. You'll see how the wood will just roll up into a nice little spiral there, and we'll work that right across. I'm going to follow that line. I'm watching that line right along the side there. Two fingers on the top, and working this right across. Now when I get towards the end, if I continue this across, I can blow out that back side. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come off here and work just the end with the chisel and then work it back that way. there's a couple ways to deal with this. You could either come from this side, you could even come here and make a little chamfer down to the line right here. So I'm watching that line. Where's that? There's the line right there. Now when I come this way, I won't blow out that back side. That chamfer protects that. So we're just working this down to the line. Really, we're using the chisel just like a plane, just planing, paring away the tenon. The advantage to this method is this teaches you this paring technique, which is very, very beneficial for fitting the tenons. So while you're shaping the tenon cheeks, you're learning how to pare away the wood, which is something you're going to have to do even if you saw it. You still may have to pare these tenon cheeks away. Let's flip it over. We'll do the other side as well. You can actually work this a couple ways. I could, in fact, work the entire cheek material away by working across the grain. Okay? What I could do is come in here with the mallet and just take a little bit of wood off like that. Okay? Now we're going to work it up like this. Then we'll work it closer. And you'll notice what I'm doing is I'm starting up at an angle like this. Then I gradually decrease that angle. So I start up at an angle like this, come up like this, come up like this, then lower it down. Every single cut is up and out. What I don't want is I don't want to create a stop. I don't want to go straight in like this and create a wall. Then the chisel doesn't have anywhere to go. So every cut comes up, up like this, and you lower it down. Watch how I do that. You can use your hand, your palm. I'm not taking very much material off. Now you see every single chisel cut comes all the way up and out. You see that spiraling up there? I love those shavings. Look at that. Just a nice spiral. It's amazing how the wood actually spirals like that in a beautiful curl. Now I'm going to work down to the line. Again, I put my fingers on top to help stabilize the chisel. Now you'll see what we've got here. We've got a flat tenon, but it's obviously angled. Our goal here is to lower this whole thing down. Lower it down like this. Now you see what I've got here? I've started to create exactly what I said not to do, and that is we've got this wall. So what happens is the chisel just stops right there. It won't go anymore. See, we've got to stop there, a wall. We don't want that. What we've got to do is we've got to come up above that and work it out. So I'm going to work it all the way out like this. Now we're starting to get towards the end here, and if I continue out, I could blow this backside off. So let's just come in here and create our little chamfer right down to the line. And then we can work it right down. Again, I'm using the 1-inch chisel here. This really is the chisel of choice. Work it all the way down to the line. I'm watching that line, making sure that we're there. So I've essentially used the chisel as a plane, making a nice cut all the way down to the bottom. You can see that there's a little remnant of the line left, actually a lot on this side and a little less over here. It depends. I can even test this into one of these mortises and just see how close we are. I'd rather have to take off a little wood than take off too much. And I can clearly see that I really can come a lot closer to the line. So we'll do that. We'll go ahead and get closer to the line using the exact same paring technique. There we have it. We are very close to the line. We could even test it. I'm not going to actually fit it yet, but I can just see how close we are. Look at that, right on. That's exactly what we want. We've got a little bit of leeway there where we can trim it down a little bit more. So that's one way to do the tenon cheeks. Another way is to saw it. You can use your tenon rip saw. Of course, sawing is one of those things that you've got to practice. It's a skill that you've got to practice, and practice makes perfect. So don't be discouraged if you try to saw and the saw tends to wander a little bit. Of course, it's helpful to have a good saw, one that's set up, tuned, and sharpened correctly. If you've got your own saw and you feel up to sharpening it, refer back to our sharpening videos where I go over how to tune up and sharpen a rip saw. You can also buy one. There's some great saw suppliers out there. Lee Nielsen makes a wonderful rip saw. And we'll go ahead and cut this. Now, I want to stay on the waist side of the line. What's the waist side of the line? Well, it's this part right here. It's this outer part. So I really want to leave that line. I don't really want the saw to go in the line. I don't want to split the line. This saw is probably about 25 thousandths thick, so if I split the line, I'd be making my tenon too thin. So I want to stay on the outside of the line, but just come right up against the line. Okay? What you can do is you can actually take your thumb and position it right there and push the saw over to get it started. You'll notice what I'll do here is just start on this back side. Now the teeth are generally a little bit bigger on the rip saw. So it actually tends to maybe dig into the material a little bit more. So what you really have to do is you've got to lift up on the saw. Just take a little stroke like that, lift up on the saw. Okay, now I'm going to come over here like this. Now keep in mind too, that as I've mentioned, wood is like the series of straws. We're back to those straws again. And if I saw like this, you'll notice it's a lot easier to cut through those straws. However, if I saw like this, look what happens. Those saws are the straws, not the saws, are wanting to break like this. So it's actually easier to saw up with those fibers like this. What I like to do, I like to saw a little ways down like this. Now you'll notice what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly lower the saw forward. And again, this is a wider piece, 4 inches wide, so we've got to make sure we keep that saw straight. And we'll just lower it down. You can even come back like this and lower it back to meet it like this. Sometimes I'll do that as well. Now that we've got it nice and straight across the top, you can even see a little remnant of the line. Now that we've got it nice and straight, we can cut down a little ways. Now let's lower the saw down like this. So what I'm doing is I'm forming a guideline down this way. Some people will actually turn the piece around and form a guideline on the backside. I don't do that because I feel like it's wasted motion, but if you're comfortable with it, or you prefer, you can actually turn it around and follow down on this side. This is the way I do it. Following through, working it down like this. You'll notice I'm using the entire length of the saw. I like to use a 14-inch tenon rip saw for this. Mainly the 14-inch because it's longer and I get more stroke with it. Now when I get towards the end, I know I'm close to the end. I don't want the saw to dig into the shoulder, so I see this. And when I get right to the end, I can just take it and pop it off. Then you can come back with a chisel and just clean up right towards the end right there. I want to show you another one of my favorite saws, one that you might not be familiar with. But this is a great saw right here. This is a traditional frame or bow saw. The reason why I like this saw is that I have a long blade. This is configured for rip, so it cuts on the, if it's ripping with the grain, I've got it cutting on the push stroke, just like this Western style saw. It does take a little bit of skill to get to use this saw, but it's a nice lightweight saw. You've got a long stroke, so you can cut through very fast. Watch for our video on how to make this type of saw. You can actually build your own bow saw like this. Again, the same technique. Work it like that. Now I'm going to come in like this, work this side, lower it down, connect the two by coming across. Now I can bring it down like this, just like so, following that line all the way down. Now we can really take that material right off. Nice long stroke. And then right when we get towards the end, listening to that tone change, everything changes slightly when we get towards the end. And there we have it. We can take that last little bit off. Now sometimes the two may not have joined together, so let's just cut it just a little bit more. I don't want to overcut it. There we have it. So as you see, there's multiple ways to remove the waste wood on the cheeks. You can chisel it, you can saw it, you can use a tenon rip saw or a bow saw. Whatever method you prefer, I would practice using all the methods. Now there's some woods that you may prefer to saw. Take, for example, this one where there's a knot right there. That's going to be difficult to chisel. Not impossible, but more difficult. So I would most likely saw this one here. Let me continue cutting the remainder of these tenons. You'll notice here I've changed positions. I've got my arm resting on the piece, and I'm using the mallet, which can save your palm when you're chiseling away. I can also see the depth line, and I'm working this right down rather to the depth line. Now we can come in like this, making these nice short strokes, bringing this up. Just like this. Keep in mind both hands are behind that cutting edge. It's easy here to go below the line. You want to make sure that you don't go below the line, and it might be helpful even to mark the line with a marker, just because sometimes it's easy to confuse the grain line with the marked line. So that might be helpful. Here we've got a little knot right on the end. I want to show you some of the things that you can encounter. If I was to go straight in like this, every piece of wood's a little different. So if I was to cut in like this, I'm going to take a little tiny bit off and just kind of feel the grain. I'm not hitting it hard, I'm just kind of feeling the grain, and I can see that the grain kind of feels like it wants to dive down a little bit. So I don't mind taking a little bit off the top, but I certainly don't want to take too much off. Oh, right there, diving down. I got to be really careful. I'm taking off maybe a 1/16 or so, 1/8 of an inch. Just a very, very tiny bit. Watch that grain, see, watch that cut. As it goes in, it is almost diving too far. Now I should be able to work across the grain. And again, right in like this, right down to that depth line. And I was able to chisel right across that knot. Again, if you're going across the grain, you really can go right across the knots using the right technique and, of course, a sharp chisel.